what we're doing tonight is we're going to discuss Dr. Wielenberg's paper, Craig's Contradictory Kalam, Trouble at the Moment of Creation. And just to clarify, this is a discussion of his paper, and it's not a conclusion of his paper that God does not exist. And so it wouldn't be like a criticism of his paper to bring up like fine tuning or the moral argument. That would kind of be off topic. We're just sticking to his paper tonight. I hope you have had time to read it. If you look on the left up at events, you'll see the events there. I've posted a link to his paper and a summary video, as well as our other events are up there as well. So I hope you've had a chance to read it. If not, Dr. Wielenberg in a moment will just give us kind of a brief summary of the main points of it, and then we'll turn to Q&A. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns to bring up, he'll be happy to do that. Let me just send a general message letting everybody know that we're in here, in case it didn't already. Oh man, I got some lag. All right. So yeah, Dr. Wielenberg, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then you give us a quick summary of the paper, and then we'll see what questions people may have.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for asking me to do this, and thanks for everybody for listening. This is my first Discord experience, so this is kind of a fun experiment. So, yeah, I teach philosophy at a small liberal arts college, and I'm really interested in the philosophy of religion. I tend toward atheism myself, but I'm very interested in Christian philosophy, and I've spent a lot of time engaging with some of the work of William Lane Craig. I think he's a very sharp philosopher, has some really interesting ideas, and he's also an interesting figure because he's a real public intellectual. So it's a kind of a cool combination of good philosopher and then also engaging with a broader audience. So this particular paper is focused on Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. I'm not sure how much people know, so I'll just maybe give a bit of background, but probably this is familiar to many people, where the basic idea of that argument is, as Craig has formulated it lately, he says it's got these two main premises. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause, and then the other premise is that the universe begins or began to exist, and so we get the conclusion that the universe must have a cause. Those are the main premises and conclusion, but that doesn't quite get you to the existence of God. So this is supposed to be an argument for the existence of God. So, I mean, those premises just get you to the conclusion of the universe has some cause of its beginning, and then you need some further supplementary reasoning to get you to the conclusion that this first cause is God. And there's been a lot of attention paid to the two main premises of the argument, and not really as much paid to the sort of extra bit that's supposed to show that this first cause must be God. But that part is, quite important, right? That's the part where God really enters the discussion. And so, what I was really interested in was that part of the argument, and then also trying to really get clear on what Craig's view is about the nature of this first cause, about God, and what's going on when God causes the universe to begin to exist. And initially I was thinking there was some things that were maybe ambiguous or could be a bit clearer. So I wrote this short paper where I suggested that there seemed to be two contradictions in Craig's theistic theory about the beginning of the universe. And really what I was hoping for was that this might provoke Craig to respond, and that would bring some clarity. And in fact, that's what happened. So at this paper, there was a sort of back and forth between Craig and I. And maybe I'll talk a bit about some of that later on. But so that's kind of the setup. So let me get into the two alleged contradictions that I suggested Craig's theistic view had in this paper. And in the paper itself, I present them in a somewhat academic fashion, so maybe I'll try to just be a bit more intuitive. in explaining some of these ideas. So the first apparent contradiction arises, or it involves the question of when God creates the universe, when his act of creation occurs, is he timeless or is he temporal? So is he outside of time or is he existing inside of time? So part of the background here is Craig has this very interesting view of God's relation to time, where, as Craig puts it, God is timeless without the universe, but God is temporal with the universe. And this is a kind of unusual view. I think most theistic philosophers see God as either timeless, full stop, or as within time. But Craig has the idea that at the creation of the universe, God basically enters time. So when there is no universe, hard to kind of talk about this, but when there is no universe, God is timeless. When the universe exists, God is inside of time, or is a temporal being. Okay, so the first contradiction arises from the fact that, or apparent contradiction, is that when Craig is describing his theistic hypothesis, he says things like the cause of the universe is eternal, but the effect is not. And he often speaks of his theory explaining how a timeless cause, God, can have a temporal effect, the universe. And so that's very suggestive of the idea that God is in his timeless phase, or a timeless God, we might say, causes the universe to begin to exist. So that's one part of the, sort of one half of the apparent contradiction. So it looks like initially pretty straightforward. Craig also says that timeless God wills or intends to create the universe. So you get this picture. I think a natural way of understanding this is, okay, you've got timeless God. He's willing or intending to create the universe, and then presumably it's this timeless act of will that brings the universe into being. So that makes it seem like God is, it's a timeless God that creates the universe. On the other hand, Craig also says that God's act of creation, his creative act, his act of creating the universe, is simultaneous with the first moment of time, which is the time at which the universe comes into existence. And this actually commits him to the view that when God creates the universe, he is himself temporal, or in time. And the reason for that is that Craig says, as I was mentioning earlier, that when the universe exists, God is temporal. But if God's act of creating the universe happens at the very first moment of time at which the universe exists, then that's going to make God temporal in time when he performs his act of creating the universe. And that's the other half of the apparent contradiction. So some of the things Craig says are very suggestive of God being timeless God, we might say, who creates the universe. But other things he says commits him to the view that God is actually temporal when he creates the universe. Okay, so that's one apparent contradiction. And then the second contradiction that I suggested seems to exist in Craig's view in this paper has to do with, it arises when we raise the question of relationship between God's act of creation and time beginning. These seem to be two events. So on Craig's view, one event is God bringing the universe into existence or causing the universe to begin to exist. And then another event is time starting, or time beginning, you might say. And to cut to the chase, it seems like the most plausible understanding of Craig's view, at least this is what I thought in the paper, is that God's creative act, his act of creating the universe, and time beginning are actually the same event. But that seems to lead to a contradiction, because on the one hand, Craig says that the first event must have a cause. So when he whenever he explains or defends the Kalam cosmological argument, he emphasizes the idea that the first event, whatever it is, has to have a cause. But if the first event is time beginning and is also God's act of creating the universe, if the first event is God's act of creating the universe, that suggests that first event is going to be uncaused. Reason being, when Craig explains what this act is like, he says that it's an act of agent causation. And an act of agent causation by God has to be an uncaused event, because God's act of creation is going to be a free action. So the gist of that argument, the punchline there, is on the one hand, Craig emphasizes that this first event has to be caused. Then when he explains what this first event would be, it turns out to be an agent causal act by God. And on Craig's view, an act like that would have to be uncaused. So to sum up, the two apparent contradictions are, it seems that on Craig's view, God has to be timeless. It has to be timeless God that creates the universe. But then other things he says commits him to the view that God has to be temporal when he creates the universe. And then the other contradiction involves this very first event. Some things Craig says suggest that it's going to be, he emphasizes it's got to be a caused event, but then it turns out that given the nature of this first event, it's actually, on his view, going to have to be an uncaused event. All right, that was kind of a lot, so let me stop there and see if people have questions or thoughts at this point.
Sure, and if you do have a question, what you can do is at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little hand icon, a little piece of paper with several lines on it, and if you click that, then it'll put you in queue for me to invite you on stage, and then you can ask your question or make your comment or what have you. Funny bit of trivia, so you actually debated Dr. Craig here in North Carolina at NC State University about 3.5 years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, interesting bit of trivia. So, in the parking lot, before going into that debate, I attended it. My wife let me know that she was pregnant. So,
Wow.
I will always remember that night. I will never remember what anybody said. So,
Well, that's exciting, and congratulations. So yeah, I guess there was a lot going on that night.
It was a really good debate, but yeah. All right, so we got Zach here. Let me send an invite to Zach. Once I send you the invite, you'll have another button at the top of your screen. You'll have to click that. There you go. Welcome, Zach. Thanks for coming on. What's on your mind?
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks, Dr. Wielenberg, for coming. This is actually really cool. My question was whether it's part of your view, or at least an entailment of all these different views that you've expressed, that things that are causally related, or at least causally related to the temporal world, must have some sort of temporal relation, whether it's synchronic or diachronic to temporal reality. It seems like you might, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but it seems like you might just have an issue in general with the idea of non-temporal things causing temporal things.
Yeah, good. So I don't think let me put it this way, at least. I don't think the argument I'm giving depends on the claim or premise that says, like, if the effect is temporal, then the cause must be temporal. Now, your question was whether I would accept a principle like that. I'm not sure. I'd have to give that one more thought. But I don't think I'm using a premise like that in the argument. But I think this is a good sort of helpful question. So, you know, when I make the case in the paper, when I'm trying to explain why it seems that Craig is committed to temporal when he causes the universe to begin to exist, the argument there is it doesn't really depend on the premise that, like, if the effect is temporal, then the cause must be temporal. It's rather two ideas that Craig emphasizes. One is that whenever the universe exists, God is in time and is temporal. So that's one idea. And the other is his emphasis on the fact that God's act of creation is simultaneous with the first moment of time and with the first moment at which the universe exists. So it's those two ideas together that you might say pull or place God in time as he causes the universe to come into existence. So it's not really that any temporal effect must have a temporal cause. It's rather Craig saying that whenever the universe exists, God is in time. And then Craig also saying that God's act of creating the universe is simultaneous with the first moment at which the universe exists.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Good question.
All right, I got a question from Hats Off. Let me go ahead and send you the invite. Again, you have to click a button at the top. Oh, there you go. Hey, Hats Off, how are you doing?
Thank you very much, Professor Wielenberg. Sorry, I'm struggling to pronounce a new name.
Yeah, it's a little tricky. You're fine.
No, thank you very much for your presentation. I also have been, well, I was going to say I've been frustrated with trying to understand Craig. I'm in general frustrated with trying to understand, various philosophers such as yourself. I'm not a philosopher, so it's an uphill battle for me.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But what I did find is that I guess Craig has something called a relational view of time. I'm not completely clear on that, but on his view, apparently something like events being more what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe primal than time.
Yeah.
Time depends on events happening on Craig's view, right? Not events depending on time.
Yeah.
Flowing.
Yep.
So on Craig's view, the first moment in time is created by the act of God doing anything at all. And so I guess in your argument that I was trying to read in that paper, and I did try, but you were saying that there's kind of a first moment in time where God is... Gosh, I wish I could phrase this question better than I am right now. I guess what I'm asking is, it's as if you're... Maybe I've misunderstood you, but it's as if you're taking time as a little bit more primitive than events, and you're saying, well, this event happens at this time. But Craig would say that this time is created by the event.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll leave it there.
Good. I think this is great, and I think you're right. And so let me say a bit about this. I think the way this fits into discussion, at least most obviously, is that it would relate to this second alleged contradiction in the paper. So yeah, I think I think what you said makes sense, and I think it shows actually that this second alleged contradiction isn't actually a serious problem. So I mentioned earlier that after I wrote this paper, then there was this sort of back and forth between Craig and I. And in his reply, I think Craig said essentially, offered essentially the sort of thing you're saying in connection with the second contradiction. So at least as I explained it in the original paper, what was supposed to get the contradiction going, one of the ideas that was supposed to get the contradiction going, was that there'd be some puzzle about basically God causing time to begin while already being inside time. But I think you're right that the relational view actually suggests that that's not actually a serious problem. And so the way I think Craig would look at it is, just as you say, you've got a timeless God, static, not doing anything, and God acts. And I think Craig's view that the first thing that God is going to do is cause some stuff to come into existence, and then from there the universe is going to unfold. And just as you said, I think on Craig's view, one way of putting it would be that time beginning is, you might say, going to be parasitic on God performing this first act, this first agent causal act of bringing some stuff into existence. And I think that actually pretty much diffuses the second alleged contradiction that I argued for in this paper. And so my latest thinking is that the first contradiction is the more interesting and serious challenge for Craig's view. And in his reply, he offered some responses to that first contradiction. Maybe we can talk about that in a bit. I think his response there leads to other trouble. But basically, at this point, I think the first contradiction that I explained is the real source of trouble. And the second one is not so serious, precisely because of the relational view of time that you explained. So you said you were struggling with philosophy, but despite that, I think you did pretty well.
All right. One question I have about that, though, is it seems as though you're saying, so if Craig's view is that time begins to exist in virtue of his bringing about T1, wouldn't that mean that essentially that the earlier than later than relationship would then have to obtain between the timeless phase of his existence and the temporal phase? But obviously a timeless phase can't have temporal relations. Or am I misunderstanding?
So I think, let me see if I can understand you. So, but I mean, I think you're exactly right that Craig definitely says that God in his timeless phase is not temporally related to anything. So one thing on Craig's view that we can't say is that timeless God exists before the universe exists. That's not going to make sense on Craig's way of thinking of things. So it's more that I guess the way to explain it is, it's like God just acts, like he creates something. To flesh this out a bit, maybe this will help to sort of get our heads around this. So God is there timeless, nothing is happening. So no events, no time. On this relational view, time is parasitic on the occurrence of events. And so God does something. And this sort of breaks the inert timelessness. And that act of doing something, I guess you might say, brings along with it as almost, I'd say, a kind of side effect, the first moment of time. It's at that point that time begins. But, I mean, notice, it's, on this view, what's causing time to begin is an event which, of course, exists within time. So I think one thing that emerges from all of this, I think this becomes clearer from some of the things Craig said in response to my argument, is it turns out that on Craig's view, the cause of time beginning and the universe beginning is entirely within time. So when Craig responded, it emerged, or maybe we could say he clarified, that God is fully temporal when he causes the universe to begin. So that's how Craig, I think, would want to avoid having to say that there's a temporal relationship between timeless God and like the first moment of time or something like that. Did that get at your question?
Yeah, I think so. So I think I guess the way that it would diffuse it then is if you think that there must be some prior to the creation of the universe, then okay, we'll put the creation of the universe at T2, and then at T1 God begins to create the universe, and then he does it at T2, and so that's how there's temporal relations. Is that what you're saying, that he wouldn't have to actually specifically create time, he would just bring about different events that are in these temporal relations, and then therefore there's time?
Yeah, I think it's and all of this is happening at T1. So one thing that I think is important is on Craig's view, there's a ton of things happening all at T1, this first moment of time. You've got time beginning, you've got God bringing the universe into existence, you've got the universe beginning, and this is because on Craig's view, he thinks the causal act and its effect are simultaneous. So T1 is action-packed. Sure. And I guess another way of putting it is that God doesn't have to sort of specifically it's not like in addition to creating some matter or energy or something, then he also has to like separately cause time to come into existence or something like that. It's on this relational view, you get that for free. It comes along as again, like I was saying, kind of a side effect.
Sure.
All God really has to do is just like make something,
And then there's time.
and then we're off and running, and we've got time. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Well, we got a question from Scott. Go ahead and send out the invite. Hey, Scott. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for your time, Dr. Wielenberg.
Sure.
You had earlier wanted to address the first apparent contradiction, and I had some questions or a pedantic sort of remark that a view I feel Craig could take regarding that. I don't think it's a very good view to counter it, but a potential escape from that.
Okay.
And it sort of there are two parts. So the first part is that you noted in note 1 of your paper that sometimes Craig says timeless, sometimes he says eternal in his argument, and this is in contrast to temporal. So your argument sort of rests on the state of God being timeless at this T1 and temporal at T1, and that being a contradiction. But if timelessness is not actually defined in contrast to temporality, meaning instead of that timeless is not necessarily atemporal, being an opposite, then Craig could argue that his deity was simultaneously timeless and temporal, and that there is no contradiction between those two properties. They are seemingly contradictory because in most instances they do contradict, but not necessarily in all situations.
Yeah, I think that that's a possibility worth exploring. I do think that, in fact, I think Craig does see them as incompatible. Yeah. But I mean that, if you could, and I suppose to sort of flesh this out, the thing to do would be to give then some account of timelessness, other than simply not temporal, right?
I'm used to certain apologists making terms that would be seemingly contradictory to me and arguing that they are in fact not contradictory. Like a common way to address the problem of evil is to argue that something can be both good and evil at the same time, and therefore there's no contradiction between evil existing and omnibenevolent God.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah.
The second sort of view that I think Craig could take, which is perhaps even more absurd, but I don't think it's more egregious than what he's currently doing, is arguing that so time and space are fairly fundamental properties of the universe. And from even a secular point of view, they didn't necessarily begin. The Big Bang is an expansion of time and space, or expansion of space from a very dense state, and time, that's as far back as we can see back, but it's not necessarily beginning. So we're not saying those things began to exist from a secular point of view. If Craig is saying those fundamental properties of the universe began to exist at that time, couldn't he argue something as fundamental as like the law of non-contradiction began to exist at that point in time? Meaning, so God was both temporal and atemporal at that point in time, and that is in fact a contradiction, as you state. But contradiction, the laws of contradiction, weren't in existence at that point, and therefore, yeah, it's a contradiction, but it's fine. Logic can work that way at that point in time, and at some later point or simultaneously, the law of non-contradiction comes into being.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me think about that. I mean, again, I think just as far as so there's kind of, as we think about this, I guess there are two questions. I mean, one is, as we consider possible responses, one is, well, would Craig like this? And I mean, I'm sort of interested in that. But there is also, like, regardless of whether Craig would sort of like it or not, is it worth considering? And yeah, this idea of maybe, if we've got a picture where, certainly on Craig's view, we've got time and space beginning at T1, and then presumably also, it's at that time that what we would think of as the laws of nature, laws of physics, I suppose, also spring into being. And so as you think about it that way, then you might think, okay, so it's just one further step. Maybe the laws of logic also spring into being or something at that time. So like, without, Craig says without, sorry, in his timeless phase, God exists without the universe. Maybe God exists without the laws of logic in his timeless phase as well, which is interesting to consider. So again, I think Craig is not a fan of God really creating logic in that way. I suppose another thing though is, I mean, there's a catch, I think, which is if we've got the laws of logic springing into existence at that first moment of time, in the paper, the contradiction was supposed to be occurring at T1. So actually, God would sort of be caught in the net, you might say, of logic. So in other words, even if I think if I'm understanding it right, even if we took that view, I'm not sure it would actually help, because at T1, when the alleged contradiction occurs, the law of contradiction would be true, and so we'd still have a problem.
And if I may,
Does that make sense?
unless I'm very mistaken, I'm pretty sure I'm not. Dr. Craig grounds logic in the mind of God, and so he would say that moral virtues are grounded in the character of God, and the laws of logic are grounded in the mind of God. So morality is how God is, logic is how God thinks, and so on that view, whenever you've got God, you've got logic. And so it couldn't ever be the case that logic would begin to exist, because then God would have to begin to exist. So I think that wouldn't be an out for on William Lane Craig's view, just because again, God would have to not exist and exist at the same time.
Yeah, good. I think that helps explain why Craig isn't going to like this idea. So, in God's timeless phase, of course, he still has his mind, and so the foundation for the laws of logic would be there timelessly. So that's good as far as bringing out why Craig, I don't think, is going to like this idea of the laws of logic starting to exist at T1. But I think it's interesting, even on that view, if the contradiction is happening at T1, the laws of logic are in place at T1, then there would still be a problem.
Yeah. All right. Well, Scott, if you got any last comments, and then I'll go to Zach.
No, go ahead and move Zach on up.
All right. Thank you. All right, Zach, you're on.
Yeah, I wanted to continue pulling on this thread that the last two comments were on, and I was wondering if, again, there's this further question of whether Craig will actually like this, but I wanted to, see if maybe I could articulate a potential resource that someone broadly in Craig's ballpark might be able to have here.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And the idea is that, so the relational view of time, as we've said, is that time is parasitic on the relationship between events. So I'm wondering if this first act, this initial act of creation, could it be indeterminate, whether that's really T1 until that event causes another event to come in, and that first event falls away? Then it makes sense to me to say, like, oh yeah, that was a prior event. But imagine if there was just this one act and it never progressed to further moments. I don't know if on a relational view it would make sense to call that T1, and whether this, so let's say, that's the first question, is whether it would make sense to call that T1, and if not, I guess we would have to say it's indeterminate. And then I don't know if that actually helps get out of the contradiction that you've raised.
Yeah. So I think on this relational view, all you need to get time going is something to happen. I don't think you actually need, so if we imagine like just one thing happens, I think that would be enough for there to be time. So I don't think you need actually relations between events. You just need at least one event, if I'm understanding it correctly. So I think that, given that, if we just call this first event E1, as soon as you have an E1, I think you've got T1, even if somehow like that's it. You just have to sort of instant I think you would already have a moment of time, I guess you would say.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So if you go to general, you'll see it there, but let me go ahead and read it. My understanding of quote, time, end quote, is that there is a transition of states. There is time. That means that creating time is quite nonsense to begin with. If there is a state in which the universe didn't exist and a transition, creation, to a state in which the universe exists, then God is in time. Does that fit your view?
I understand this. Let's see. Can you read the part about the transition of states again? Let me so I can.
Sure. If it helps, I think that what Kevin is getting at is actually the kind of the way of thinking about time that I was kind of forced into by your paper, and that's that if God exists in a timeless phase and then He creates the universe, then His creating the universe, in virtue of Him creating the universe, and correct me if I'm getting you wrong here, Kevin, in virtue of Him creating the universe, that would then entail that this creation would be in a later state of affairs than the quote unquote timeless state in which He existed. In which case, His timeless phase would have an earlier than relationship, wouldn't be timeless after all, and so that it wouldn't make sense to have a timeless phase. Kevin, is that if you could just let me know if that really is what you're asking? If not, maybe you could clarify. But what would you? How would you respond to that?
Find this in the chat.
To be fair, that does. Oh, he can hear you.
Oh yeah. I just kind of wanted to look at the question again. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, if I'm understanding, so let me just maybe ask you, Matt, if it sounds right. Is part of the idea here that like is part of the thinking here that this act of creation would itself have to sort of be spread out in time or like take up some time?
I think the thinking is that if God's going to create, let's just call it Tx. If God's going to create the universe at Tx, which I'm putting in place at T1, if God's going to create the universe at Tx, then that entails that His existence from which He created the universe at Tx would be at Tx minus 1. And so then it would have an earlier than relationship to Tx. So Tx really wouldn't be T1. I guess it would be like T2 or something. And then there would be no timeless phase. There would just be the temporal phase, God temporally existing throughout His existence.
Yeah. So tell me if this helps. I mean, I think, on the way Craig is thinking of it, this creative act has got to be, I think it seems to be instantaneous, and also it's got to be simultaneous with, the universe, coming into existence or beginning to exist, I guess you might say. And, I'm thinking about, there's of course a long history of discussion of this Kalam argument. And I think that some of the early critics had the idea that, and maybe this is similar, that like, yeah, if God is causing the universe to begin, then God would have to exist before the universe began, which is precisely what Craig is wants to deny. So that the thinking there was like the causes always precede their effects. And I think it was to avoid that objection, or at least in response to that objection, that Craig then emphasized the simultaneity of this creative act with the effect of the universe. So I think that now, but again, what all this brings out is, let me highlight this. I think this is kind of an important, one important result of this exchange between Craig and I is that it became very clear that actually, in Craig's view, timeless God causes nothing. So when Craig responded to my paper, he explicitly said that in his timeless phase, God is causally inactive. And I think this is probably surprising to some people, because when you read how Craig describes things, I mean, he frequently uses the phrase like, getting a temporal effect from an eternal cause, which is very suggestive of like God in his timeless phase causing something. But then in responding, we get this picture where actually timeless God doesn't cause anything at all, just sort of there, and all of the causing is actually done by God in time, temporal God. So, I mean, I think that's an important sort of that this realization. I think this advances our understanding of Craig's view, I would say, and I think it actually leads to some other trouble. But I think here the key thing is the way he's going to deny timeless God having to be temporally related to time or the universe, like existing before the universe, is by saying that timeless God actually doesn't cause anything. It's temporal God at T1 that does all the causing.
Yeah, and it's I think it's also worth pointing out that you're obviously your paper was written. It's Craig's Contradictory Kalam, Trouble at the Moment of Creation, and so it's not just it's not a critique of God creating the universe generally. It's a critique of Dr. Craig's presentation of the Kalam, and so if the result of the paper is that somebody has to abandon or does abandon an adherence to God having a timeless phase of existence, then in as much as they've abandoned that, they've abandoned Craig's presentation of the Kalam, and so at that point the paper would be successful in defeating that presentation. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's very specific to Craig's particular hybrid view, his particular model of how the universe begins. And as I said at the beginning, I mean, partly what I was going for was to try to provoke Craig to clarify some things, and that did happen. But yeah, absolutely. So in other words, this isn't intended as a sort of broad argument that there's no way that God could have created the universe. It's very specific to Craig's particular model of timeless God, and then, sorry, I can't say and then, timeless God, timeless without the universe, and then at this first moment of time, all sorts of things happening, God becoming causally active, causing the universe to begin to exist, time starting, and so on.
Sounds good. Well, we got another question here from Hats Off. Let me go ahead and send that invite out. Hey, Hats Off, you should be on.
Thank you very much, and thank you again, Professor Wielenberg, for answering my question. I have two questions now. I hope that's okay.
Okay.
And it's actually about the first contradiction that you wanted to press about God being, both timeless and temporal at this T1.
Yeah.
And this is actually getting. I intended to get this before. It's interesting that you said that it was you think that Craig's relational view kind of diffuses the second contradiction. I confess I didn't get that far. I was still struggling to kind of understand your first contradiction in the paper.
Sure. Okay.
But if I may maybe ask again in a more specific way, Craig believes that there are two phases to God's existence.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I was kind of imagining is that on Craig's view, instead of the creative act, occurring at this T1, maybe it spans both of those two phases. And so, maybe this raises a new problem where, time spans a non-temporal and temporal phase. And that would be, I suppose, a different problem. And then my second question, maybe should I just pause there? I should pause there.
Okay, sure, yeah. And I might have some follow-up to that. So are you thinking of the idea where, sometimes actions or events, including actions, maybe can be divided into parts. We might think of God's act of creating the universe as having parts. And so are you thinking of maybe there's a timeless part and then a temporal part? So is that with what you're thinking of? You said maybe the creative act spans the two phases, so it's sort of partly timeless and partly temporal.
Something like that. It's frustrating. I'm reminded of this Kripke thing where he, in the naming and necessity, he says, the only defect of this theory is that it's wrong, but it's a common to all philosophical theories.
Yeah.
So don't have me replace it with the new one, which will just be wrong again.
Yeah.
But so something like that, I guess. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's so hard
Yeah.
to say.
Okay, yeah. So let me try. I mean, look, yes, that comment about philosophy is very much on point. And then also, I just think timelessness is very just hard to think about. And you're always falling into, I think it's very easy to slip into a temporal way of thinking. And so you'll notice I sometimes say, well, I can't quite put it that way. So having said that, let me try to say something about this the creative act having two phases, or kind of spanning the timeless and the temporal. I think there then the question might arise as to, so if we, at least the way I was thinking of it, now there's sort of like there's this act of creating the universe, and I guess we're thinking it has like a timeless part, but also a temporal part. And then I guess I'm just tempted to ask about the relationship between the timeless part and the temporal part. I mean, one basic question is actually how can those things be related? How could those things be two parts of the same thing? It's kind of hard to, especially because Craig emphasizes that anything that's timeless is not temporally related to any temporal thing. So we can't say that like the timeless part of it happens before the temporal part. And so I think there's actually a basic question as just making sense of, in what sense are they different parts or phases of a single act of creation? So that I think would be one question, like what does it sort of actually mean? And then I guess the other question would be, is there a causal relation? Like, is the timeless part causing the temporal part? And so do we have now a causal relation that crosses from the timeless to the temporal? And there's this other puzzle, which I may get into in a bit here, but Craig, in other writings, says that like if you have a timeless, if you have timeless necessary and sufficient conditions for something, say X, then X itself has to be timeless as well. So I think there are at least two questions that would need to be addressed. One, in what sense is it even possible? What does it mean to say that there's a single act of creation that has a timeless part and a temporal part? Because the timeless part can't come before the temporal part. And then if the timeless part is really sufficient for the temporal part, then it's not clear that the temporal part could actually be temporal. Like if you've got a sufficient condition, and if you've got a timeless sufficient condition for something, then that thing, it seems, would have to be timeless as well, or at least that seems to be Craig's view.
If I may, another issue there from a theological perspective is that if we say that God has different parts, which it seems like the temporal part couldn't be identical to the timeless part. From a theological perspective, what we would say is that would mean that God's composed of parts. And so Norman Geisler, in his systematic theology, had made the point that God can't be composed of parts because, in principle, if something's composed of parts, it could be decomposed. And so, if there were a object that created the universe and that had a timeless phase and a temporal phase, it wouldn't fit into theological considerations of God for other reasons. And so that may not be a move that a Christian apologist could make, because we would be committing ourselves to things that would be incompatible with our view of God. And then
just to chime in there briefly, I think this, we're sort of down the rabbit hole now, but that I think relates to the doctrine of divine simplicity. So the view you described of Geisler, I think Aquinas had a similar view, where Aquinas said something like, if God basically had parts, then there would need to be a cause or explanation why those parts were put together. and God can't have a cause or an explanation, outside of himself. But I just wanted to mention briefly another interesting wrinkle here is Craig himself actually is not a fan of the doctrine of divine simplicity.
Well, sort of. So he does hold to divine simplicity, a modest form,
Okay.
and to where God, in his being, couldn't be composed of parts. The what I might call the radical form is that everything that exists, there's part that's the form of what it's meant to be, and then the part that's existence, and it's the combination of these two that make the thing an existing thing rather than a non-existing thing, and that's how they get to God is his attributes or God is his properties or that sort of thing. But Dr. Craig does think that God is a simple object. He's not like a composite object. In his being, he's a simple object, and so he wouldn't be.
Okay, so it would be the stronger simplicity where God doesn't have like different properties. That I think that's the one Craig.
Yeah, he holds that to be
like.
Incoherent. Yeah, and I do too.
Yeah.
I have no idea what it means.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Good.
Hats off. Did you have? You mentioned you might have another question as well, or was that?
Yeah.
You're muted.
Thank you. No, I did, but actually, Professor Wielenberg kind of already answered it. My second question was basically this, which is, are these Craig's views, or are they views that are sort of that Craig is committed to on the Kalam argument, right? So, like, if they're just kind of peripheral views that Craig has, then it's not really an objection to the Kalam. But if it's something that's, that Craig is committed to via his view of the Kalam, or via any view of the Kalam, then that would be more serious. And I think that Professor Wielenberg already sort of answered that in saying that, we're trying to, well, as you said, I think, right, that we're trying to make sense of this view of timelessness and, entering time. And just speaking for myself, it's kind of gratifying for me to hear you say that, because man, it's tough for me too, and I tear my hair out just trying to think, oh my gosh, what is he getting at, man? So thank you.
Right, and again, that was
Craig,
kind of
not you.
yeah, I gotcha, and that was kind of what I was after with the paper, where a good way to get someone to clarify their view is to accuse them of contradictions, right?
Yeah.
So then I gotta come say something about that. And so I do think progress was made. I think for me, the most helpful thing that came out of the exchange was Craig sort of explicitly saying that timeless God is causally inactive, and that it's temporal God that's doing all the work. Which again, I think is not perhaps the way people typically understand Craig's view. Again, because he just routinely uses this language of an eternal cause giving rise to a temporal effect, which I think is suggestive of God in his timeless phase, doing some causing. But again, it turns out that that's not actually Craig's considered view.
All right. One question I had, it was kind of it wasn't a main point in your paper, but it was something that really stuck out to me. Is you pointed out that the timeless, God in his timeless phase, in no sense causes the existence of God at T1. Excuse me. It wouldn't be the case that the timeless God is creating the temporal God.
Yeah.
One thing that stuck out to me is I've read Dr. Craig's book, Time and Eternity, and he makes a really persuasive case for a version of identity called Endurantism, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but for the audience, Endurantism is an account for how it's basically a theory on how we account for continuity of identity. So you were you when you were 3 years old, and you're you now, but you have vastly different properties. So how do we account for it still being you, even though there's all these different properties? And the way Dr. Craig accounts for it is he says, well, you endure through time from being 3 years old to now, when you have different properties. And so that's how we account for this continuity of identity, how it's still you, even though you have these different properties. So my question is if the timeless phase is not causally connected to T1, obviously you couldn't say that God endures through time from the timeless phase to be God in the temporal phase at T1. Am I thinking too much about this? Am I putting too much into this, or do we have a problem with continuity of identity? Because God at T1 is temporal. He has different relations. He also has extrinsic relations, like being related to creation as the creator. And that in the timeless phase he doesn't. And so they have different properties. Is there some other way to account for continuity of identity? How timeless God is temporal God, or do we end up with basically two gods?
I think this is really interesting. Yeah, it was a case where I'm glad you picked up on this. I sort of mentioned it. Yeah, it was sort of like a side comment in the paper, but I do think it's worth asking this question. It was in the paper. I sort of posed the question, but didn't really try to make a big deal of it. I wasn't quite sure if it would go anywhere,
Yeah.
but I think it potentially could. I mean, so one thing that's clear is, yeah, right. So the basic question is, yeah, what is it that makes it the case that actually temporal God and timeless God are the same God? And of course, you can't use this straightforward in Endurantism view, endurance through time, because timeless God isn't in time. I mean, I think Craig would say, well, of course, if we're wondering about the identity of a timeless being and a temporal being, we need some different account of identity. I think he would probably say the endurantist view is just for purely temporal entities. But yeah, I do think, again, once it comes out that timeless God doesn't cause anything, and so we can't say that timeless God causes, temporal God to enter time. Temporal God causes himself to enter time, because temporal God at T1 is the one that's doing all the causing.
Right.
So there's at least a question. I think when I was thinking about this, I wasn't, I was kind of going for, can I derive contradictions? I wasn't sure how I could derive a contradiction from it, but it at least raises an interesting question, right? I mean, one thought might just be like, well, you got two beings that are omnipotent, omniscient, and so on. It's kind of like, well, who else? Who else would they be, or something like that? But I'm not sure if that's really philosophically adequate, right?
Yeah.
So I do think the causal inertness of timeless God makes maybe this question more pressing. On what basis do we say that they're actually the same being? Timeless God is not prior to temporal God. Timeless God, has no temporal relations, and timeless God doesn't cause anything relating to temporal God. Temporal God is the one doing everything. So yeah, what makes these two characters the same, I think, is at least a very interesting question.
All right. We've got another question from Zach. I'll go ahead and send the invite out. All right, Zach, you're on.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether, on taking the temporal horn of the dilemma that you've raised, if Craig is almost now positing a thing that is beginning without a cause, because God's temporal phase is seemingly beginning to exist, but it's not being caused by the timeless phase, as we've said. So doesn't that violate a premise of the Kalam?
Good. Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, that's pretty interesting. Now, this is an objection others have made, so I can tell you what Craig's response is, and this actually relates to what we were just talking about. So this is good because it actually shows that it's actually super important for Craig to identify, timeless God and temporal God. They've got to be the same entity. And what he says is, you'll notice he's very careful when he states the relevant premise of the Kalam. He says everything that begins to exist has a cause. And what he wants to say is that at T1, God does not actually begin to exist. He merely enters time. Now, you might want to say, well, wait a minute. Temporal God begins to exist at T1. But Craig is going to say, okay, but temporal God just is timeless God. And the reason that God does not begin to exist at T1 on Craig's view is precisely that God has a timeless phase of his existence. And so that kind of shows why Craig needs God to have this timeless phase. It's precisely to avoid him having to say that God actually begins to exist at T1. This takes us back to the question of, okay, now do we need some, on what basis are we saying that timeless and temporal God are actually the same being? Because if they're not, then we would have timeless God like beginning to exist at T1, and that's going to mess everything up.
Even if God is, timeless God and temporal God are the same entity, it seems like there's two states of affairs. There's the state of affairs where God is timeless, and there's the state of affairs where God is temporal, even if it's the same entity. And so it seems like one of those states of affairs is beginning to exist, even then, even if we accept this identity relation.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I think Craig is when he speaks of things beginning to exist. I think he's thinking of what you might call substances, like objects. This gets again sort of into the philosophical weeds, but I suspect he would say that, strictly speaking, maybe the state of affairs doesn't come into existence, but it just becomes actual or obtains or something like that. Is how philosophers sometimes speak of states of affairs. And so that premise of the Kalam argument, when he says whatever begins to exist must have a cause, I think he's thinking there of like substances that start existing. And again, he's going to want to say that because God has this timeless phase, at T1, temporal God is not a substance that comes into existence. Rather, somehow, and this is again mysterious, but he transitions from the timeless phase to the temporal phase.
Yeah, one way that I like to think about it so Dr. Craig says that temporal relationships, the reason why God can have temporal relationships is because it's an extrinsic change. And extrinsic changes don't necessarily mean that there's any change in you. So if you're in an elevator and you're on the first floor and you go up to the third floor and there's people on the second floor, then you go from being below them to being above them, even though you've made no changes whatsoever. You've just had this relational change. And so it's not that the part of you that is above them began to exist as you passed them. You just had this change in an extrinsic relationship.
Yeah, I think that's the idea. So, God entering time is like, you easing into the swimming pool or something like that. It's still the same you, just a different location or situation or something like that. The one thing that at least does make it less straightforward is in all of those cases, of course, there are temporal and causal relations between the person, outside of the pool and inside of the pool and so on. But on Craig's view, you don't have that. So timeless God is temporally and causally, cut off from temporal God. So that, I think, is maybe what complicates things a bit.
Sounds good. Well, Zach, did you have any other comments? And then I'll go to Joel.
I feel like I'm still formulating this thought, so maybe I'll just raise my hand again in a bit.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks a lot, Zach. And we are getting down to just like a couple more questions before we'll call time. But let me go ahead and send the invite to Joel. Joel, you'll have a button at the top of your screen you have to click in order to come on stage and to accept the invite. There you are. All right, Joel, you're still muted. There you go. You should be on. Hey, Joel, how you doing?
How you doing, Matt?
Good. Thanks for coming on. What's on your mind?
Yeah, so, hey, Dr. Wielenberg, how you doing?
Good. How you doing?
Good. I'm actually more familiar with your work on theistic ethics and all of that, because I'm actually writing a paper right now on that. So you and like Morriston and, Humer and Adam Johnson, I know you're familiar with him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm fairly novel to the whole, Kalam dialectic, but I wonder if you've written anything on how this would affect omnipresence, or what this would mean for something like omnipresence.
Yeah. I haven't thought about that much, to be honest. Yeah, and I guess, yeah, I gotta say omnipresence is one of those, I guess, divine attributes. I haven't really thought about it particularly deeply, so I'm not quite sure. That's one I would have to. Yeah, I guess I should just say I don't know. I want to think about that a bit more. And part of what I'm just unsure about is at least I don't recall right now. If Craig has an account of omnipresence. I don't know, Matt. Do you have a sense of what
Yeah.
Craig talk about omnipresence? What does he say?
Yeah. So one of the things we want to point out about omnipresence is the problem with it is that it has the word presence in it, right? And there's different ways that we can mean present. And what we definitely don't want to say is that God is like spatially present or locationally present everywhere, because God is an immaterial being. He's spaceless. So what do we mean then when we say that God's omnipresent? What omnipresence means is that God is, it's a sort of presence like we're present in a conversation, like you're paying attention. So you and I can focus on precisely one thing at a time. We can only like have one set thing that we're focusing on or thinking about. Whereas God, being omnipresent, focuses on everything all the time, everywhere. And so he's, immediately aware of everything all the time. And that's what omnipresence means. So it wouldn't be like a physical location type of thing. It would be almost it'd fall more under omniscience than it would anything else.
Yeah, that's interesting. If I could just jump in, so it's almost like God is just paying attention to everything that's happening everywhere, something like that.
Yep, yeah. And a strong form of it is that God is causally active everywhere. And so that could tie into being like a sustaining cause. I'm not persuaded that you need sustaining causes. It seems like once something exists, it continues to exist, and unless something changes. But those who hold that view would then say that God is immediately aware of and causally active at every location and every set of circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. Good. That's interesting. And then that reminds me of something I think is another sort of question or maybe line of thought that's worth pursuing, although I haven't done it myself. Which is just that, as you were saying that, I was reminded of on Craig's view. Yeah, Craig does not want God to be located in space, but he does have God as in time. And the thought is simply that could there be some trouble there with the way space-time is typically understood in modern physics, where not a physicist, but my sense is that at least one popular view is that there's really just one thing, space-time. And so I wonder whether that might raise some trouble with the idea that you could have an entity that is in time but not in space. If actually, there's just this one thing, space-time, does it make sense for a being to be kind of separated out in that way?
Yeah.
Again, haven't sort of pursued that, but I wonder if it's worth thinking about.
Yeah. So without going into too much detail on it, he wrote a book. What was it? I think it was In Time and Eternity. Anyway, there are a lot of theological problems with that, and he actually rejects space-time. So space-time is the Minkowski interpretation of relativity. He prefers the Neo-Lorentzian, and he says that there are a lot of contradictions, and there's various different arguments for the Lorentzian over the Minkowski interpretation. But just from a theological perspective, one of the major issues with space-time is that if it is true, then every point in space is always there. They're all equally real. And so one of the promises in the Bible is that God overcomes sin and death. But it wouldn't be the case that God overcomes sin and death if space-time is real, because all of the locations where sin and death are happening, they just all timelessly are present. God doesn't even diminish them on space-time. They're all fully. There might be a portion of space-time where it isn't, but that's not quite overcoming sin and death. If sin and death are never even diminished, and so that would be like one of the theological reasons why we'd want to reject that. But there are other reasons as well.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. I wouldn't have thought of that, a kind of theological problem with space-time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's like it can never be erased.
Right.
Is that kind of the basic
Yep.
problem? Yeah, okay, interesting.
Joel, did you have any other comments? And then I got a question in the chat, and then we'll go to the next person in the queue.
Yeah, it was just something I was wondering about. But thank you, Matt. Thank you, Dr. Wielenberg. I think we'll actually be engaging more in the future because right now I'm not
Oh, I've kind of lost you, Joel.
modified. Oh, did you?
You just
Am
came
I better?
back. Yeah, you just came back.
Yeah, I was just saying, thank you guys for taking the questions. Thank you, Dr. Willenberg. We'll actually be uh, probably engaging in the future because I'm writing a paper right now defending modified divine command theory, so Alston and Adams and those guys. I actually enjoyed your recent
Yeah.
paper on, I actually enjoyed your recent paper on that.
Yeah, yeah. Feel free to if you've got a paper, send me an email. I'm really interested in the theistic ethics stuff as well.
Sounds good. All right, so the question in the chat is a bit out of context, but as a philosopher, do you prefer the theist, agnostic, atheist trichotomy or the theist, atheist dichotomy? I'm not sure what that means. So if you know what that means, then maybe you could explain what that's asking, and then.
Well, I guess I would understand it as what are the sort of possible views or positions one could hold on the existence of God. And I guess I would tend toward the three options. I mean, it does, I guess, sort of intuitively, it seems, there's a question, does God exist? And then we've got yes, theism, no, atheism, I don't know, agnosticism. That nothing deep there, but I guess that would be my at least initial answer.
That makes a lot more sense. I thought it was one position that's theist slash agnostic slash atheist, which I don't know. You could have one position that's all three. So,
right.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, it does seem like somebody should be able to say I don't know and not have to commit to one or the other. All right, we'll do probably one more question, and then we'll call it. So Zach, you're next in the queue. I got the invite out to you. All right, Zach, you're on.
Okay, I collected my thoughts on what we were talking about earlier, which is that timeless temporal transition.
Okay.
And so it seems to me that everything we've said here and what you've shown is that Craig's view has to allow that there's a timeless to temporal transition where the timeless state is not causing the temporal transition. So if that can happen, if there can be a temporal transition of an entity that is not caused by its timeless state, couldn't that just happen with the universe?
Right. Let me just make sure I understand the last part. Sorry, when you say it couldn't happen with the universe, you mean could God make it happen with the universe, or could the universe just sort of happen without
the universe
God?
could do it. The universe could do it without God.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I think that's very interesting. Again, I want to think more about this timeless to temporal transition. I've already my brain with the timeless God who becomes temporal, and then this is kind of another wrinkle into that. But let me say this: I think another idea that's worth pursuing is, as we think about Craig's view, especially as I was saying before, it now seems that the timeless God is not doing anything. Another, sort of possible line of attack might be, okay, given what Craig is saying, do we actually need God anymore, right? Could the universe just do something similar? And I think, to maybe flesh that out a bit, once you realize that on Craig's view, all of the causation happens within time, and that sort of raises the question of like, well, could there just be some sort of thing, entity that's there timelessly, not God, but some other sort of object, and then something happens, and now we're off and running, and that's how the universe begins. So, and I take it your question is a similar one. Like, suppose we can make sense of this timeless to temporal transition, then could there just basically be a non-theistic version of that? So, I'm not sure. I want to think about it more, but I think it's a very interesting question. In general, as we understand Craig's view, basically, is there a kind of non-theistic version or analog of his scenario where you wouldn't need God at all? I think is definitely worth thinking about.
Are you there, Zach?
Yeah. Can you? I just said thank you.
Oh.
That answers my question.
Perfect, thanks. Well, Dr. Wielenberg, if somebody wasn't terribly familiar with your work and they wanted to start to read through what you've produced, what would be a good place for them to start, a good book or article for them to start reading to start to work through your views?
Sure. Yeah, I would probably the most accessible one would be I've got a book called Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe, which is it's certainly less technical than this paper, I think. So that might be a good starting point. Can I also, if we've got can I just maybe say a couple of things here about this debate with the discussion with Craig about the Kalam.
Sure.
I've got another paper coming out that's a kind of follow-up to all of this. It's going to be coming out in Philosophia Christi, and I think it's the next issue. Should really be out any time. But I'll just highlight sort of very quickly the kind of main idea of that paper. So the progression is, I had this initial exchange with Craig, where it seems like the way he avoids he tries to avoid the first contradiction by saying, okay, timeless God actually doesn't cause anything. It's temporal God that does all the causing, which I think is helpful as far as understanding his view. But there's one other thing he says, I think that leads to some trouble, which is he also insists on timeless God timelessly willing or intending to create the universe. So one thing is like, okay, what is sort of the point of that? Normally you'd think, well, okay, if that's because he's timelessly willing to create the universe, and so he must be causing something or making something happen, but he's not. So you have this sort of weird scenario where timeless God is timelessly willing a universe to create, but doesn't really seem to do anything because timelessly there's no universe. But the basic argument of the paper is if God actually is timelessly willing to create the universe, then that would actually just be a sufficient condition for the universe to exist. And then by Craig's principles, the universe itself would have to be timeless. So kind of the theme, and I think even the title of the paper is basically, Craig's God cannot create a temporal universe or a universe with a beginning. It looks like Craig's timeless God, if it wills to create a universe, and then it appears that on Craig's own view, the universe itself would have to be timeless as well. So that's the latest move in this exchange that is coming out.
What if you were to respond that God always intended, and yeah, it is kind of, you wonder what that means to intend something without, I guess, intending it. I don't know, because it seems like if you intended to do it, you would do it. But if he said that God's act of acting on that intention is different than the intention itself, and so that the act of acting on that intention is at T1, but the intention holds timelessly, would that be an adequate response, or how
so in fact, Craig, I think, does say something like that, but in the paper I argue that that's just not going to work. And I guess what is inexplicable is how there could be any sort of gap between the intention and the execution or acting on that intention. It's sort of like what's the holdup?
Yeah.
Now you can't say holdup because there's no time passing, but what is it that is sort of getting in the way, or could be making it so that God's timeless intention is not accompanied by an exercise of his power to create, which again would seem to entail on his principles that the universe itself is then timeless as well.
Yeah. And what's the name of the paper that you're writing?
Yeah, I think it's title is basically something like the thesis, so it's something like actually, hang on one second. I can get the actual title for you. Give me 1 second.
Sure.
Okay, so the title is just the thesis, which is Craig's God cannot create a temporal universe.
Okay, and that's out already. People can read it, or
it's forthcoming. It literally it's supposed to be the winter episode, the winter issue of Philosophia Christi, we're now into spring, so it's like, okay, that could really come out any day, I would think.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wielenberg, for coming on. Really appreciate your time, and definitely been a really interesting conversation. I did post a link in the general chat to Dr. Wielenberg's book on Amazon. You can find that. I looked it up and posted the link there if you want to get started there. You can also, on the left at the top, you'll see our events tab for future events on the server. Yeah, thank you so much, and I really appreciate your time.
Hey, you're welcome, and thanks to you. This has been great. Again, my first Discord experience. Yeah, this is a great workout. I really appreciate it. Thanks for everyone who participated, asked questions, and everything. This has been great. So thanks a lot, everyone. I enjoy it.
All right, great. Thanks so much.